The saloon fell silent when Violet Dawson's first tear hit the rough-hewn floorboards of the Tumbleweed Saloon. It was 1878 in Redemption Creek, Arizona territory, and a woman crying in public was considered a spectacle rather than a tragedy. Violet stood there, letter clutched in her trembling hand, shoulders heaving as she fought to maintain the composure she'd already lost. "Well, would you look at that?" drawled Hank Peters, the town's most notorious gambler. Miss High and Mighty finally broke. His companions snickered, their laughter spreading through the saloon like wildfire. Violet's face burned with humiliation. She'd only stopped in to ask if anyone had seen the stagecoach her brother was supposed to arrive on, not to become the entertainment for the afternoon. The letter that had arrived instead of her brother told of his demise at the hands of bandits just outside of Tucson. "Seems the schoolmarm ain't so proper after all," another voice called out, followed by more cruel laughter. Violet tried to gather her dignity, to stem the flow of tears that wouldn't stop, but grief and exhaustion had finally caught up with her after weeks of worry. Her brother Thomas had been her last living family member, and now she was completely alone in a town that had never truly accepted her in the 3 years she'd lived there. "That's enough." The deep voice cut through the jeering like a knife. Garrett Vance stood at the saloon's swinging doors, his tall frame silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. The crowd parted as he strode toward Violet, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. "She's got reason to cry." Garrett's reputation as the most skilled horseman and occasional bounty hunter in the territory preceded him, and most men in Redemption Creek knew better than to cross him. He hadn't been in town for months, tracking outlaws for the U.S. Marshal, but his timing couldn't have been more perfect or more devastating. "What's it to you, Vance?" Hank challenged, though he took an instinctive step back. Garrett fixed his steel-gray eyes on the gambler. "The lady just found out her brother's dead. That letter's from the marshal in Tucson." He'd recognized the official seal on the paper in her hands. "So unless you're fixing to apologize, I suggest you shut your mouth." The silence in the saloon grew heavier as Garrett gently placed a hand on Violet's elbow. "Let's get you out of here, Miss Dawson." Violet looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes, shocked that he knew her name. In their few brief encounters over the years, they'd never been properly introduced. She was the respectable schoolteacher. He was the lone cowboy who came and went like a tumbleweed. Their worlds rarely intersected in the rigid social hierarchy of Redemption Creek. "Thank you," she whispered, allowing him to guide her outside, away from the prying eyes and callous remarks. The hot Arizona sun beat down on them as they stepped onto the dusty Main Street. Garrett led her to a wooden bench outside the general store, far enough from the saloon that they couldn't hear the resumed conversations inside. "I'm sorry about your brother," he said, his voice softer than she would have expected from a man of his stature. "Thomas was a good man." Violet looked up in surprise. "You knew Thomas?" Garrett nodded, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. "We rode together a few times. He spoke highly of his sister, the schoolteacher in Redemption Creek, said you were the smartest person he'd ever known." Fresh tears welled in Violet's eyes, but there was a warmth in them now. "He wrote that he was coming to stay, said he'd found something that would change our lives." She looked down at the crumpled letter. "Instead, I find out he died trying to stop a stagecoach robbery." "That sounds like him," Garrett said, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Always the hero." "And now I'm alone," she whispered, the weight of her reality settling over her like a heavy blanket. "Not entirely," Garrett replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Thomas asked me to look out for you if anything ever happened to him. I gave him my word." "You barely know me, Mr. Vance. I couldn't possibly." "It's just Garrett," he interrupted. "And a promise is a promise, especially one made to a friend." Before Violet could respond, the town's mayor, William Bradford, approached them, his face a mask of practiced sympathy. "Miss Dawson, I've just heard the terrible news. Please accept my condolences." "Thank you, Mayor," Violet replied, quickly wiping away her tears. "I hate to bring up business at such a time," Bradford continued, not sounding particularly remorseful. "But with your brother's passing, I must inform you that the school board will need to discuss your living arrangements. The teachers' quarters are intended for families, and as a single woman, you can't be serious," Garrett cut in, rising to his full height. "Her brother's body isn't even in the ground yet." Bradford squared his shoulders, though he had to look up to meet Garrett's gaze. "It's not personal, Vance. It's policy. Without a male relative, it's improper for Miss Dawson to occupy the family residence. We have appearances to maintain." "She can stay with Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house," Garrett suggested, but Violet was already shaking her head. "Mrs. Henderson doesn't accept single women." "She believes we attract trouble," Violet said bitterly. It was one of Redemption Creek's many unspoken rules that made life difficult for women on their own. Bradford cleared his throat. "The school board meets tomorrow. We'll make our decision then." With a tip of his hat, he walked away, leaving Violet with a new worry atop her grief. "I have some savings," she said, more to herself than to Garrett. "Perhaps I could rent a room somewhere until—" "Until what?" Garrett asked gently. Violet looked up at him, her blue eyes swimming with uncertainty. "I don't know. Thomas was all I had left. I came west to be with him after our parents died. I don't have anywhere else to go." Garrett was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "I might have a solution, but it's not conventional." At this point, "Mr. Vance Garrett, I'm open to suggestions. I own a small ranch about 3 miles outside of town. It's nothing fancy, but there's a cabin that belonged to my foreman before he moved on last month. You could stay there until you figure things out." Violet's eyes widened. "I couldn't possibly. What would people say?" A rueful smile crossed Garrett's face. "They'll talk regardless. But if it helps, my housekeeper, Mrs. Ortiz, lives on the property with her husband. They're good people." "You wouldn't be alone." Violet considered his offer. The prospect of losing both her brother and her home in one terrible day was overwhelming. Yet accepting help from a man, she barely knew a man with a reputation as a loner. An occasional hired gun went against everything she'd been raised to believe was proper. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, searching his face for ulterior motives. Garrett's expression was sincere. "Like I said, I made a promise to your brother. Besides," he added, his voice taking on a softer quality, "everyone deserves kindness when they are hurting." In that moment, looking into his gray eyes, Violet saw something she hadn't expected: compassion. Not pity, not obligation, but genuine concern. "Thank you," she said finally. "I accept your offer, at least until I can make other arrangements." Garrett nodded, replacing his hat. "I'll come by the schoolhouse tomorrow after your classes end. We can talk to the school board together if needed." As he walked away, Violet watched his retreating form and wondered what twist of fate had brought this solitary cowboy into her life on the very day she needed someone the most. The next day, Violet struggled through her lessons, the children's curious eyes following her every move. News traveled fast in Redemption Creek, and even the youngest students had heard about her tears in the saloon and Garrett Vance's unexpected intervention. "Miss Dawson," little Emma Porter asked during arithmetic, "is it true you're going to live at Mr. Vance's ranch?" The classroom fell silent as 20 pairs of eyes focused intently on their teacher. "That's not an appropriate question for school time, Emma," Violet replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Now, Who can tell me what 7 times 8 equals? When the school day finally ended, Violet wasn't surprised to see Garrett waiting outside, leaning against the hitching post with 2 horses saddled and ready. What did surprise her was the crowd of school board members gathered on the porch of the town hall across the street, watching them with undisguised interest. "Are you ready?" Garrett asked, straightening as she approached. "For what exactly?" she asked, eyeing the second horse warily. "The board meeting's been moved up. They're waiting for us." Violet's heart sank. That was fast. "Small towns," Garrett said with a shrug, "never waste a good opportunity for gossip." Inside the town hall, the 5 members of the school board sat in judgment behind a long oak table. Mayor Bradford presided, flanked by the town's most influential citizens. Mr. Peterson, the banker, Mrs. Whitaker, the minister's wife, Dr. Thompson, and Mr. Collins, who owned the general store. "Miss Dawson," Bradford began without preamble, "the board has convened to discuss your situation in light of your recent bereavement." "I'm aware of why we're here, Mayor," Violet said, squaring her shoulders. "Yes. Well," Bradford continued, glancing uneasily at Garrett, who stood silently beside Violet, "we've come to the conclusion that it would be improper for a single woman of your age to continue residing in the teachers' quarters." "With all due respect," Violet began, but Mrs. Whitaker cut her off. "It's for your own good, dear. A woman alone invites speculation, and after your display at the saloon yesterday—" "My display," Violet repeated incredulously. "I had just learned of my brother's death." "Nevertheless," Bradford interjected, "we've decided you have until the end of the week to vacate the premises." "That's only 3 days," Violet protested. "The decision is final," Bradford said firmly. Garrett, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Miss Dawson has already arranged alternative accommodations. She'll be staying in the foreman's cabin at my ranch, with Mrs. Ortiz as chaperone." The board members exchanged glances, and Mrs. Whitaker's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline. "Mr. Vance," she began in a scandalized tone, "surely you understand that such an arrangement would be highly irregular. A single woman living on a bachelor's property is perfectly respectable with proper chaperoning," Garrett finished for her. "Unless you're suggesting that Mrs. Ortiz, who has been a pillar of the church for 20 years, is unsuitable." Mrs. Whitaker sputtered, unable to criticize Alina Ortiz, whose reputation for propriety was unimpeachable. "Furthermore," Garrett continued, "I've taken the liberty of speaking with Reverend Whitaker this morning. He sees no impropriety in the arrangement, given the circumstances." Mrs. Whitaker's face reddened at the mention of her husband's approval, which he had apparently given without consulting her. "Well," Bradford said after an uncomfortable silence, "if the Reverend has no objections and if Miss Dawson is agreeable to this solution, I suppose the board can accept it as temporary." "I am agreeable," Violet said firmly, grateful for Garrett's foresight and intervention. "Then it's settled," Garrett said, offering his arm to Violet. "Miss Dawson will vacate the teachers' quarters by week's end as requested." As they left the town hall, Violet could feel the stares of the townspeople following them down the street. "You spoke to Reverend Whitaker?" she asked quietly. Garrett's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "I figured we might need some divine intervention. The Reverend's a fair man when his wife isn't whispering in his ear." Despite everything, Violet found herself smiling for the first time since receiving the devastating news about Thomas. "Thank you, you didn't have to do any of this. I told you I made a promise." "Is that the only reason?" she asked before she could stop herself. Garrett looked at her then, his gray eyes thoughtful. "No, Miss Dawson, it's not." 3 days later, Violet stood in the empty teachers' quarters. the last of her belongings packed into 2 trunks. The room that had been her home for 3 years now looked barren and impersonal, as though she had never lived there at all. A knock at the door announced Garrett's arrival. He had come with his wagon to help her move, just as promised. "Ready?" he asked, taking in the sparse room. "As I'll ever be," she replied, attempting a brave smile. Together they loaded her trunks onto the wagon. Violet took one last look at the schoolhouse before climbing up beside Garrett on the driver's seat. As the wagon pulled away, she felt the stares of townspeople watching from windows and storefronts. "They'll have something new to gossip about by next week," Garrett said, correctly interpreting her discomfort. "I suppose," Violet sighed. "Though I doubt they'll forget the spectacle of the schoolmarm crying in public and then running off to live with the mysterious bounty hunter." Garrett chuckled, the sound deep and unexpectedly warm. "Is that what I am? Mysterious, aren't you?" she challenged. "You come and go as you please, tracking outlaws one day and tending cattle the next. No one really knows much about you. What do you want to know?" he asked, surprising her with his directness. Violet considered this as the wagon rumbled along the dusty road leading out of town. "Why Redemption Creek? You could live anywhere." Garrett was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "My father owned the ranch. When he died 5 years ago, I came back to settle his affairs, intending to sell the place and move on. But something about it felt like home." He glanced at her. "I'd been wandering a long time, figured it was time to put down roots. Yet you still take bounty hunting jobs." "Less often now," he admitted. "The ranch is doing well enough. I only track men the law can't catch or won't." "Like the men who killed my brother?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Garrett's hands tightened on the reins. "Thomas was tracking something before he died, something big. He sent me a telegram asking for help, but by the time I got to Tucson, it was too late." Violet's breath caught. "You were there." "When he No," Garrett said quickly. "He was already gone, but I've been following the men responsible. That's why I was away these past months." "Did you find them?" Violet asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet, but I will." They rode in silence for a while, the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels the only sounds. Eventually, the landscape opened up to reveal a valley with a modest ranch house nestled against a backdrop of red mesas. "Welcome to the Rocking V," Garrett said as they approached. The main house was larger than Violet had expected, a sturdy 2-story structure built of local stone and timber. A corral with several horses stood nearby, and beyond that, a smaller cabin sat nestled among cottonwood trees near a small creek. "It's beautiful," Violet said honestly. As they pulled up to the main house, a plump, middle-aged woman with silver-streaked black hair emerged onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "There you are," she called out. "I was beginning to think you got lost, Garrett, Mrs. Ortiz," Garrett said warmly as he helped Violet down from the wagon. "This is Miss Violet Dawson. Violet, this is Alina Ortiz, the finest cook in the Arizona Territory, and the reason this ranch runs as smoothly as it does." Alina's warm brown eyes crinkled as she smiled. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Miss Dawson. I am very sorry about your brother. Garrett told us what happened." "Thank you," Violet said, immediately warming to the woman's genuine kindness. "My husband, Miguel, is out checking the herd with the boys, but he'll be back for supper. I've prepared the cabin for you fresh linens, swept floors, and I put some flowers to brighten it up." "That's very kind of you," Violet said gratefully. "It's nothing," Alina waved dismissively. "It's nice to have another woman around. Too many men on this ranch, it's all cattle talk and mud-tracked floors." Garrett rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "I'll take Miss Dawson to the cabin and bring her trunks. Is supper at the usual time? 6 o'clock, Alina confirmed. Don't be late. The cabin was even more charming up close, a snug one-room structure with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, a curtained-off sleeping space, and simple but comfortable furnishings. True to Alina's word, wildflowers brightened the table, and everything was spotlessly clean. It's perfect, Violet said, stepping inside and feeling, for the first time in days, a sense of peace. The door has a good lock, Garrett pointed out, though you won't need it out here. And if you need anything, the main house is just a short walk away. As he brought in her trunks, Violet noticed a small bookshelf stocked with well-worn volumes. She ran her fingers along the spines, surprised to find classics alongside dime novels and practical guides. The books were my father's, Garrett explained, seeing her interest. He was an educated man who loved a good story. Feel free to borrow any that interest you. Thank you, Violet said, touched by the gesture. For everything. Garrett nodded, suddenly seeming uncomfortable with her gratitude. I'll leave you to get settled. Supper's at 6, but only if you feel up to it. Alina would be happy to bring you a tray if you'd prefer to be alone. After he left, Violet sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the day's events. A week ago, her life had been orderly and predictable. Now her brother was dead. She'd lost her home, and she was living on the ranch of a man. She barely knew a man who had shown her more kindness than anyone else in Redemption Creek. For the first time since receiving the news of Thomas's death, Violet allowed herself to truly grieve, away from judging eyes and cruel whispers. And as the tears came, there was a strange comfort in knowing that here, at least, no one would mock her for them. That evening, Violet decided to join the household for supper rather than hiding away in the cabin. As she approached the main house, she heard laughter and conversation spilling from the open windows, a cheerful sound that made her realize how lonely she'd been in town, where she'd kept herself apart from others due to her position as teacher. Alina welcomed her warmly, introducing her to Miguel, a weathered man with kind eyes, and the two ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse, young brothers named Jose and Francisco Martinez. Garrett, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt, seemed different in this setting, more relaxed, less the vigilant cowboy and more the ranch owner among people he trusted. The meal was delicious enchiladas with Alina's homemade salsa, beans, and fresh tortillas. The conversation flowed easily, with the men discussing the day's work and Alina sharing town gossip she'd heard from her sister who lived in Redemption Creek. Is it true the school board tried to force you out immediately? Alina asked Violet, passing her more tortillas. Violet nodded. They gave me 3 days. Miguel shook his head disapprovingly. That Bradford always so concerned with rules when they benefit him. What will you do now, Miss Dawson? Jose asked. At barely 20, he was the youngest at the table and spoke with the directness of youth. I still have my teaching position, Violet replied. I'll continue with that while I figure things out. The truth was, she had no idea what her future held now that Thomas was gone. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need, Garrett said firmly. No rush to figure anything out. After supper, Garrett walked Violet back to her cabin, a lantern lighting their way in the gathering dusk. The silence between them was comfortable, punctuated by the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. Your ranch family is lovely, Violet said as they reached her door. I can see why you decided to stay. Garrett nodded, his face softened by the lantern light. They make it a home. Before them, it was just a place I owned. I know what you mean, Violet said softly. The teacher's quarters never felt like home, not really, just somewhere I lived. Garrett seemed about to say something more, then changed his mind. Rest well, Miss Dawson. I'll drive you to town for school in the morning." "Thank you, but that's not necessary. I can ride. I saw a gentle mare in your corral that would suit me." Surprise and what might have been admiration flickered across Garrett's face. "You ride? My father taught me. Thomas and I used to race when we were younger." A pang of grief shot through her at the memory. "Buttercup would be perfect for you," Garrett agreed. "She's steady but not too slow. I'll have her saddled for you after breakfast." As he turned to go, Violet called after him, "Mr. Vance Garrett." He paused, looking back at her. "Thank you for defending me yesterday, in the saloon." His expression softened. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," she pointed out. "You did." In the lantern light, his gray eyes seemed to darken. "Get some rest, Violet. Tomorrow will be easier." And somehow, hearing him say her name for the first time, she believed him. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm. Violet rode to school each morning, taught her classes, and returned to the ranch each afternoon. The townspeople whispered, of course, but she found that living outside town provided a buffer against their judgment. At the ranch, she had space to breathe, to grieve, and slowly to heal. Elena became a friend, teaching Violet to make tortillas and sharing stories of her childhood in Sonora. Miguel showed her his vegetable garden behind the main house, proudly explaining each plant and inviting her to help herself to fresh tomatoes and peppers. Even the Martinez brothers adopted her as a sort of honorary sister, bringing her wildflowers they found while checking the herd and asking her to read to them in the evenings. Francisco was learning English, and Jose wanted to improve his already decent reading skills. And then there was Garrett. He maintained a respectful distance, but Violet often caught him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. They developed a habit of sitting on the porch after supper, sometimes talking, sometimes just enjoying the spectacular desert sunset in companionable silence. It was during one of these evenings, about a month after Violet had moved to the ranch, that Garrett finally spoke of Thomas's death in more detail. "Your brother was investigating a land fraud scheme," he said, his voice low so it wouldn't carry to the main house where the others were playing cards. "Powerful people buying up ranches through intimidation, forged deeds, even murder, making it look like accidents or bandit attacks." Violet's hand stilled in her lap. Thomas was a lawyer. He mentioned in his letters that he was working on a big case, but he never shared details. "He was gathering evidence," Garrett confirmed. "He tracked the scheme to someone in Redemption Creek, though he didn't know who exactly. That's why he was coming here, to investigate further and to warn you." "Warn me? Why would I need warning?" Garrett's face was grave in the fading light. "Because he believed whoever was behind it had connections to the school board. He thought you might be in danger if they discovered what he was doing." Violet felt cold despite the warm evening air. "The school board, like Mayor Bradford, possibly, or someone connected to him. Is that why you offered me a place to stay? Because you thought I was in danger?" The question came out sharper than she intended. Garrett looked her straight in the eye. "It was part of it," he admitted, "but not the whole reason." "What was the whole reason?" she asked, her heart beating faster. Before Garrett could answer, the sound of approaching horses made them both turn toward the road. A cloud of dust announced riders coming fast, too fast for a social call, especially at this hour. Garrett was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. "Get inside," he told Violet, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. But Violet stood her ground. "What is it? Who's coming?" "I don't know," Garrett said grimly, "but nobody rides like that at dusk unless there's trouble." The riders, 3 of them, thundered into the yard, pulling their lathered horses to a stop before the house. Violet recognized them immediately. Hank Peters, the gambler who had mocked her tears, Sheriff Wilson, and to her shock, Mayor Bradford himself. "Vance," the sheriff called out. "We need to talk." Garrett stepped off the porch, positioning himself subtly between Violet and the newcomers. "What brings you out here so late, Sheriff?" "We've got questions about some missing documents," Bradford said, dismounting with the stiffness of a man unaccustomed to long rides. "Documents that belong to Thomas Dawson." Violet stepped forward, ignoring Garrett's warning glance. "My brother's papers, what about them?" Bradford's eyes narrowed as they fixed on her. "Miss Dawson, we believe your brother was in possession of certain, sensitive information. Information that rightfully belongs to the town of Redemption Creek." "What kind of information?" Violet demanded, her teacher's instinct for detecting lies triggering alarm bells. "Land records," the sheriff supplied. "Deeds, surveys, that sort of thing." Garrett's stance shifted subtly, becoming more alert. "And why would the town need those specifically? The county keeps copies of all official documents. These were unique copies," Bradford said carefully, "with annotations that might be misinterpreted by those who don't understand the complexities of territorial expansion." "You mean evidence of fraud?" Garrett said flatly. Bradford's face hardened. "Mind your accusations, Vance. We're here on official business. At my private property after dark." "With no warrant," Garrett countered. "Doesn't seem very official to me." Hank, who had been silent until now, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Told you he'd be difficult," he muttered to Bradford. "Miss Dawson," the mayor said, ignoring Garrett now, "if you have your brother's papers, I strongly advise you to turn them over, for your own safety." "Is that a threat, Bradford?" Garrett's voice was dangerously quiet. "It's a reality," Bradford replied smoothly. "Bandits are a constant danger in these parts. The same ones that killed her brother could easily target an isolated cabin like this one." The implied threat hung in the air like gunsmoke. "I don't have any papers," Violet said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Everything Thomas owned was still in Tucson when he died." "Search her cabin," Bradford ordered the sheriff. "You don't give orders on my land," Garrett said, his hand now resting openly on his holstered revolver. "Sheriff, you know better than to search without a warrant." Sheriff Wilson hesitated, caught between the mayor's authority and the law he was supposed to uphold. "He's right, Bradford. We need a warrant." Bradford's face flushed with anger. "This is bigger than legal technicalities. Those papers could ruin what exactly?" Violet interrupted, stepping forward. "Or should I say, could ruin whom?" A tense silence fell over the yard. Even the horses seemed to sense the danger, shifting nervously under their riders. "We'll be back," Bradford finally said, mounting his horse with obvious effort. "With a warrant." "In the meantime, Miss Dawson, I'd consider your position carefully. The school board might reconsider your employment if they felt you were uncooperative with town authorities." As the three men rode away, Violet found herself shaking not with fear, but with rage. "They killed him," she said quietly. "They killed Thomas because he found proof of whatever they're doing." Garrett turned to her, his face grim in the gathering darkness. "Not them specifically, maybe, but someone they're working with, yes, I believe so. What do we do now?" she asked, looking up at him. "Now," Garrett said, taking her hands in his, "we find those papers. Because I'm betting Thomas sent them to the one person he trusted most in the world, his sister." In the soft glow of the cabin's oil lamp, Violet emptied her trunks one by one, searching for anything Thomas might have hidden among her possessions. Garrett sat at the small table, watching her methodical exploration. "It would be something ordinary," Violet reasoned aloud. "Something that wouldn't attract attention if my belongings were searched." "Did he send you anything before he died? Letters, packages?" Garrett asked. Violet paused in her search, thinking. Just letters, and those were sent to the school. The last package I received from him was months ago, books for my birthday in February. Books? Garrett sat up straighter. Where are they? Here, Violet said, pulling a small stack of leather-bound volumes from the bottom of her second trunk. 3 novels and a collection of poetry. Garrett joined her on the floor, taking the books and examining them one by one. What kind of man was your brother, Violet? The kind who would write in books. Understanding dawned on her. Never. He considered it sacrilege to mark a book. Together they flipped through each volume, finding nothing in the first 2. The third, a copy of The Last of the Mohicans, yielded a folded piece of paper tucked between the last page and the back cover. A map, Garrett said, unfolding it carefully, of land parcels around Redemption Creek. Violet leaned closer, their shoulders touching as they studied the document. Certain parcels were marked with red ink, others with blue, and notes in Thomas's precise handwriting filled the margins. Look at this, she said, pointing to a blue-marked area. That's your ranch. And this note says targeted for acquisition, summer '78. Garrett's face darkened. They're planning to take my land next. And look, all these red-marked parcels have already changed hands in the past year. The Wilkinson Place, the Murphy Ranch, Old Man Hernandez's homestead. All places where the owners died or left suddenly, Garrett confirmed grimly. Deaths that looked like accidents or bandit attacks. But why? Violet asked. What's so special about this land? Garrett studied the map more closely. There are survey markers here, elevation lines. All the targeted properties follow the creek and its underground branches. He looked up, his gray eyes intense. Water rights. In the desert, water is more valuable than gold. Someone's buying up all the water access in the county. And they're willing to kill for it, Violet whispered, the full weight of the situation hitting her. Thomas discovered this and they killed him for it. This is evidence, Garrett said, carefully refolding the map, but it's not enough to prove who's behind it. We need the rest of Thomas's documentation. If it exists, Violet said doubtfully. Bradford seemed to think I had it. Which means it must exist, Garrett reasoned. Think, Violet. Where else might Thomas have hidden information for you? Violet closed her eyes, trying to think like her brother. He was coming here to see me, but he never made it. So anything else he wanted me to have would have been with him when she broke off, unable to finish the thought. When he was killed, Garrett said gently. What happened to his personal effects? The marshal in Tucson wrote that they'd be sent to me, but they never arrived. Because Bradford intercepted them, Garrett concluded. They've been searching for whatever evidence Thomas collected. A thought struck Violet. The school board meeting tomorrow. Bradford said they'd be discussing my employment. What if they're planning to use that as an excuse to search my belongings again, or to get rid of me entirely? Garrett's jaw tightened. I won't let that happen. The intensity in his voice made Violet look up sharply. In the warm lamplight, his face was all angles and shadows, his eyes reflecting both concern and something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster. Why are you helping me, Garrett? She asked softly. The truth this time. He met her gaze steadily. Because from the moment I saw you standing in that saloon, refusing to be ashamed of your grief despite their mockery, I knew you were the strongest person in that room. Because Thomas loved you enough to die protecting you. Because he hesitated, then continued more quietly. Because when I'm with you, I remember there are things in this world worth fighting for. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Violet reached out, her hand finding his. We'll fight together then, she said. For Thomas. For justice. Garrett's fingers tightened around hers. For a future, he added, his voice barely above a whisper. In that moment, surrounded by the scattered contents of her life and the evidence of a conspiracy that had already claimed her brother's life. Violet felt something unexpected bloom in her chest, not just determination or courage, but hope. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect Arizona day that made it hard to believe in the darkness of human greed and corruption. Garrett and Violet had stayed up late into the night, formulating their plan and sharing it with Alina and Miguel, who had promised their unwavering support. "Remember," Garrett said as he helped Violet mount Buttercup, "stick to the plan. No matter what happens at the school board meeting, don't let them provoke you." Violet nodded, adjusting her skirts over the side saddle. "I'll be careful. Meet me at noon as we discussed." "I'll be there," he promised, his hand lingering on hers longer than necessary. "Be safe." The ride to town gave Violet time to compose herself, to rehearse what she would say at the meeting. By the time she arrived at the schoolhouse, she felt ready, nervous but determined. The children were subdued that morning, picking up on their teacher's tension. Violet did her best to keep the lessons normal, but by mid-morning, word had spread through town that the school board was convening at 11 to discuss the teacher situation. Parents began arriving early to collect their children, casting curious or sympathetic glances at Violet. At precisely 11 o'clock, as the last child left with her mother, Mayor Bradford entered the schoolhouse, followed by the other board members. "Miss Dawson," he said with false cordiality, "thank you for accommodating our schedule." "The children's education comes first," Violet replied evenly, "but I'm happy to address the board's concerns now." Bradford's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, well, concerns have indeed been raised about your living situation. A school teacher must be above reproach, as you know." "I wasn't aware that accepting shelter from a respected rancher with proper chaperoning was cause for reproach," Violet said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Mrs. Whittaker sniffed disapprovingly. "It's the appearance of impropriety, dear. And after your public display of emotion at the saloon—" "My grief for my murdered brother, you mean," Violet interrupted, her patience thinning. Now," Bradford said soothingly, "no one is questioning your loss. But combined with your unconventional living arrangements, it raises questions about your suitability as a moral example for our children." "What exactly are you proposing, Mayor?" Violet asked directly. Bradford exchanged glances with the other board members before responding. "We believe it would be best for all concerned if you took a leave of absence, just until more suitable accommodations can be arranged. And my replacement during this leave of absence, have you already selected someone?" Violet knew the answer before Bradford's momentary hesitation confirmed it. "Mrs. Bradford has graciously offered to step in temporarily," he admitted. "She has some teaching experience from back east." "Of course she has," Violet thought bitterly. Aloud, she said, "I see. And would this temporary arrangement include occupancy of the teacher's quarters?" Another telling glance between board members. "For convenience, yes," Bradford confirmed. "Convenient indeed," Violet remarked. "Especially considering those quarters sit on one of the few properties in town with direct access to the underground spring that feeds Redemption Creek." The silence that followed was absolute. Bradford's face drained of color while the other board members looked confused. "I don't know what you're implying," Bradford finally managed, his voice strained. "Don't you?" Violet asked, moving to her desk and removing the map from her reticule. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory." Before she could unfold it, the schoolhouse door burst open. Sheriff Wilson stood there, breathing heavily. "Fire!" he shouted. "The livery stable's ablaze and it's spreading fast." The board members jumped to their feet, thoughts of Violet's dismissal temporarily forgotten in the face of immediate danger. "We'll continue this discussion later," Bradford said tersely, hurrying out with the others. As soon as they were gone, Violet quickly gathered her personal items and the map. Outside, she could see smoke rising from the direction of the livery stable and townspeople rushing toward it with buckets. In the commotion, no one noticed her slip away toward the church, where Garrett was waiting as planned. "Did it work?" she asked as she approached the small cemetery behind the church. Garrett nodded, emerging from the shadows of a large oak tree. Miguel and the boys set a controlled fire in the empty stall at the back of the livery. Enough smoke to cause alarm, but no real danger. "That buys us some time," Violet said, "but not much. Bradford nearly had a seizure when I mentioned the underground spring." "Then we were right about the water rights," Garrett said grimly. "Now we just need to find the rest of Thomas's evidence before they realize we've tricked them." Together, they moved toward the small, freshly dug grave marked with a simple wooden cross bearing Thomas Dawson's name. The grave held no body. Thomas had been buried in Tucson, but Bradford didn't know that. It was a memorial marker Violet had asked Reverend Whittaker to place in the cemetery. "Are you sure about this?" Garrett asked as they knelt beside the grave. Violet nodded, remembering the last letter she'd received from Thomas before the official notification of his death. He had written cryptically about placing his trust in hallowed ground and how, even in death, family remains connected. Words that had seemed like philosophical musings at the time now took on new meaning. Using the small spade Garrett had brought, they carefully removed the top layer of soil from the empty grave. About 2 feet down, the spade struck something solid. "A box," Garrett murmured, brushing away dirt to reveal a small metal strongbox. It was locked, but the key hung on a cord around Violet's neck sent to her by Thomas months earlier with instructions to keep it safe for when it's needed. Inside the box lay a stack of documents, deeds with forged signatures, letters between Bradford and investors in California, records of payoffs to the sheriff, and most damning of all, a signed confession from the man who had been hired to ambush the stagecoach and kill Thomas Dawson, a confession witnessed by a judge in Tucson before the man himself had mysteriously died in his jail cell. "This is everything we need," Violet breathed, carefully replacing the documents in the box. "Enough to bring Bradford and his conspirators to justice. We need to get these to the territorial marshal right away," Garrett said, helping Violet to her feet. "Before Bradford realizes what we've found." But as they turned to leave the cemetery, they found their path blocked. Hank Peters stood there, revolver drawn, and pointed directly at them. "Hand over the box," he demanded, his voice cold. Garrett positioned himself in front of Violet. "You're in over your head, Peters. This goes beyond Redemption Creek now." "I don't care," Hank spat. "Bradford's paying me good money to make sure those papers disappear, and you too with them if necessary." "You'd murder us in a churchyard?" Violet asked, appalled. Hank's laugh was without humor. "Wouldn't be the first grave dug here today." What happened next unfolded in seconds. As Hank momentarily glanced at the disturbed gravesite, Garrett lunged forward, knocking the gun aside just as it discharged. The shot went wild, and the 2 men grappled for control of the weapon. Violet clutched the strongbox to her chest, frozen in terror as the men fought. Then, seeing her chance, she swung the heavy metal box with all her strength, striking Hank's temple. He crumpled to the ground, unconscious. "Nice hit," Garrett said admiringly, retrieving Hank's gun and tucking it into his belt. "Teacher's arm," Violet explained with a shaky smile. "Years of writing on the blackboard." The sound of running footsteps approaching made them both tense, but it was Miguel and the Martinez brothers who appeared, attracted by the gunshot. We need to get to the territorial marshal's office in Silver Springs, Garrett told them quickly. Bradford and his men won't be distracted by the fire for long. Take my wagon, Miguel offered. It's faster than riding with that box. The boys and I will tie up this one, he added, nodding toward the still unconscious Hank. What about the townspeople? Violet asked, concerned. Bradford might take his anger out on them when he discovers we've escaped with the evidence. I'll send Jose to the army post at Fort Benton, Miguel decided. They can have soldiers here by nightfall. With the plan set, Garrett helped Violet into Miguel's wagon and took the reins. As they pulled away from Redemption Creek, Violet looked back at the town that had been her home for 3 years, a place where she had been respected as a teacher, but never truly accepted as a person, never allowed to show human weakness or emotion without judgment. We might not be able to come back, she said softly. Even if Bradford and his conspirators are arrested, their supporters will remain. Garrett's eyes remained fixed on the road ahead. Would you want to come back, I mean? Violet considered the question. The children need a teacher, she said finally. There are children in other towns, Garrett pointed out. Towns where you could start fresh, where no one has seen you cry and judged you for it. Is that what you want, to leave Redemption Creek? She asked, studying his profile. Garrett was silent for a long moment. The ranch was my father's dream, not mine. I stayed because it was the first place that felt like home after years of wandering. He glanced at her, his gray eyes intense. But home isn't always a place, Violet. Sometimes it's a person. The words hung between them, full of promise and possibility. What are you saying, Garrett? She asked, her heart pounding. I'm saying that wherever you decide to go after this is over, I'd like to be there too, if you'll have me. Violet's breath caught in her throat. Are you proposing, Mr. Vance? A slow smile spread across Garrett's face. I reckon I am, Miss Dawson. Probably not the best timing with us fleeing for our lives and all, but Violet didn't let him finish. She leaned across the wagon seat and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that contained all the answer he needed. When they finally reached Silver Springs late that afternoon, the territorial marshal took one look at the evidence they presented and immediately dispatched riders to Redemption Creek with arrest warrants for Mayor Bradford, Sheriff Wilson, and their co-conspirators. By the time Violet and Garrett returned to the ranch 2 days later, Bradford and his associates were in custody, and the town was buzzing with the scandal. The army had maintained order, preventing any reprisals against those who might have supported Violet. Reverend Whitaker had taken temporary charge of town affairs, promising elections for a new mayor and sheriff within the month. The school board wants you back, Alina told Violet as they sat around the dinner table that evening. Reverend Whitaker came by earlier to say they're offering a formal apology and a raise in salary. Violet exchanged a glance with Garrett. That's generous of them. They're afraid you'll sue the town for what Bradford did, Miguel observed shrewdly. Or that the territorial governor will dissolve the town charter entirely when he learns how corrupt the leadership was. What will you do? Alina asked, looking between Violet and Garrett with knowing eyes. Garrett reached for Violet's hand, holding it openly on the tabletop. We have some ideas, he said, smiling at the blush that rose in Violet's cheeks. Later, as they walked back to Violet's cabin in the gathering dusk, a ritual that had become precious to them, both Garrett stopped by the creek that gave his ranch its name. I've been thinking, he said, turning to face her. This land is too big for one person, or even two. What are you suggesting? Violet asked, though the smile playing at her lips suggested she already knew. A school, Garrett said simply. A proper school right here on the ranch. For the children of the surrounding homesteads who live too far from town, and for any town children whose parents prefer a teacher who understands that showing emotion isn't a weakness. Violet's eyes widened. You do that. Turn part of your ranch into a school. Our ranch, Garrett corrected gently. If you'll marry me, that is. I know it hasn't been long, but yes, Violet interrupted, her eyes shining in the last light of day. Yes to marriage, yes to the school, yes to building something new together. Garrett pulled her close, his arms strong around her waist. No one will ever mock your tears again, he promised. Not while I'm alive, to remind them that feeling deeply is a strength, not a weakness. And no one will call you mysterious or dangerous again, Violet countered. Not when they see how gentle you are with the children and animals in your care. Their lips met as the first stars appeared overhead, a promise exchanged beneath the vast Arizona sky. In each other, they had found not just love, but understanding, the freedom to be fully themselves, with all their strengths and vulnerabilities accepted without judgment. 3 months later, Violet stood in the doorway of the newly constructed schoolhouse on the Rocking V Ranch, watching as children from both town and outlying homesteads filled the simple wooden desks inside. Elena had decorated the room with wildflowers, and Miguel had crafted a proper blackboard that spanned one entire wall. Strong arms encircled her waist from behind, and Garrett's voice murmured in her ear, "Ready for your first day, Mrs. Vance." Violet turned in his embrace, her wedding ring catching the morning sunlight as she placed her hands on his chest. "More than ready, Mr. Vance." As the children settled into their seats, Violet took her place at the teacher's desk, feeling a sense of rightness that had been missing in her previous classroom. Here, in this place they had built together, she could be both the composed, knowledgeable teacher and the woman who wasn't afraid to show her heart. "Welcome," she said to the expectant faces before her, "to a new beginning." And when one small girl at the back raised her hand to ask if it was true that Miss Violet had once cried in the tumbleweed saloon, Violet simply smiled and said, "Yes, I did. Because sometimes life gives us reasons to cry and other times, reasons to rejoice. The important thing is to have people around you who understand both." From the doorway where he still stood watching, Garrett nodded in silent agreement. They had found in each other not just love, but the courage to be authentic in a world that too often demanded masks. And in that authenticity, they had discovered their greatest strength.